Hello, and welcome to ONEByte's second virtual QuickByte. My name is Erica Emerson, and I'm the founder and CEO of ONEByte. It is my privilege to bring to you these virtual learning tools, or QuickBytes, to learn, improve, and excel with knowledge and tools for client success. In being here today, you're demonstrating your commitment to lifelong learning. Thank you. The webinar is being recorded, as are all of our QuickBytes. The recording will be available to you from our YouTube channel within 5 business days of today's live event. Our aim is to support you, so we invite you to watch the recording throughout the upcoming year. We are excited to have you participate in today's QuickByte authentication, 3FA. It doesn't have to be painful. For those of joining the live session, we have set aside time for questions and answers, and we have a few polls for your anonymous input. Please use the chat feature to submit your questions throughout the presentation. We will answer those questions at the end, and we'll be sure to follow up with you via email if we miss any. Let me turn it over to today's presenter, Al Basseri, the Chief Technology Officer of Arculus. Al?
Hi, how are you today? Thanks for taking the time. Thanks, Erica. Hopefully everyone could see what I have displayed on the screen before I get started. Thumbs up will be perfect. Sounds good. So first of all, before I get started, it's no surprise I don't need to mention cybersecurity, as one of the callers and one of the attendees mentioned. It's all over the news. We hear about it. We hear about data breaches. And we hear about cybersecurity issues on a daily basis. I'm sure the topic, it's something that's hot and that you guys are familiar with. But specifically, what I want to cover today is not just three-factor authentication, but the evolving trends in cybersecurity. So what does that really mean? Okay, so one important fact to mention here in regards to cybersecurity. There's a lot of similarities between our efforts and war on drugs initiatives and our efforts in cybersecurity. We have actually this year surpassed the amount of money we spend on cybersecurity in North America versus what we invest on war on drugs. And I'm sure a lot of you know this already. The war on drugs is now 50 years old. Officially started during a Nixon administration in 1971, and we're still fighting it. And it's, if you look at it, it has evolved over decades. And certainly there's some similarities in terms of our efforts in cybersecurity. And specific to that is when we talk about evolution and evolving our cybersecurity efforts, it's also true specifically to the different branches of cybersecurity. Certainly one of the main branches of cybersecurity is authentication. And some of you might be familiar with it, but there's this concept of multi-factor authentication. It's been around for 30 years. It was around the idea and the technology that were available before we were on the cloud and the SaaS platforms were widely accepted. So multi-factor authentication has been around for a while. It's $11 billion market, and then there's different standards. Some of you have used it on a daily basis. I'm sure if you've ever logged into a portal and had to initiate a one-time password on authentication, you're familiar with two-factor authentication. And some of you use it every day in your corporate entity or enterprise. But there's different factors of authentication, and what's important, and this is a general statement about cybersecurity, is that for every cybersecurity vendor, for every CISO, for every IT manager or director, there's a fine line between absolute security and usability. And it's a struggle that we as an industry always go back and forth. How do you make something so secure but at the same time not so painful for your average user where they adopt to it, that they use it, right? It's something like, it has to be so useful and the user experience got to be so easy, like we brush our teeth every day, twice a day, right? So that is the dilemma. And when you think about multi-factor authentication, a lot of what is in play today in terms of drivers, in terms of agents, in terms of deploying endpoint management to update the patches and other software, it's actually a very painful experience, not just for the user, but even for cybersecurity and IT department. And that is one of the downfalls of multi-factor authentication. So it's not about today. I want to discuss to you three-factor authentication, but someone could come in and say, well, what about 4FA and 5FA? The reality is just having more authentication is not just the answer. It's also about addressing scale and usability. It's got to address human behavior where it is not painful to authenticate, and it has to be flexible enough around the evolving environments. So as I mentioned before, most 2FA that's in play today, the technology itself is 30 plus years old, starting to show its age. When 2FA really came into the market 30 years ago, we didn't have Office 365, we didn't have Salesforce, we didn't have AWS, we didn't have 160 plus SaaS application, your typical Fortune 1000 company. So obviously, when the technology is implemented, we didn't necessarily have the complexity that we face today, right? And in terms of two-factor authentication, a lot of the second factor, the tokens that you see, or the little USB stick, or the one-time passwords, some of them are frankly an unnatural act for your average user. So it's inconvenient, it's high cost, expensive to manage and monitor. So you think about the extra cost that you have to invest in terms of training, endpoint management, and supporting a hybrid environment. So it's no big surprise that the most popular version of 2FA in the market today is the one-time password 2FA. But it turns out that one-time password OTP is actually the weakest from a cybersecurity point of view architecture in terms of 2FA. It's a self-service model. So it's the self-service password recovery is actually very attractive for hackers and people for ill intent. They're trying to break your authentication workflow. So let's talk about our challenge today. I talk about evolution in cybersecurity and evolving cybersecurity market. At any given time, there are 2,500 cybersecurity vendors, different branches of cybersecurity, as you see on that chart, and that's just a small sample. The average cost to run an effective cybersecurity department in any major North America metropolitan area is $1 to $3 million for every 4 to 6 people. So for every 4 to 6 people is $1 to $3 million. For many of us, we simply the option of doubling your cybersecurity group every 12 months or 18 months is not reality. There are a lot of enterprises over there that simply, frankly, just tap out. They go straight to an MSSP or a third party to manage their cybersecurity operation. Why is that? Why is this? It's because it's difficult to evaluate even a small subset of 2,500 cybersecurity vendors. Number two is this endless patch, upgrades, integration. Will it work with this API? It's a mess, and it's keeping both cybersecurity and IT departments under siege. Coupled on top of all this is the fact that how we consume applications, both from an enterprise, B2B or a B2C, has changed. Just as our car habits have changed. I always love to use the car habit analogy. 30 years ago, you went and bought a car. Occasionally, you went on vacation and you rented a car from Hearst or Dollar Rental Car. Today's different, right? You got 3 different models. You could either go buy a car or lease a car. You could go still rent a car, and then you also have the Ubers and the Lyfts of this world. So the paradigm has changed. It's also true in terms of our application deployments. No longer are we behind a single firewall, and I'm sure most of you know this already. We are running both decentralized applications and centralized, and we have hybrid environments. Some of our data sets and critical applications are running on a SaaS platform. We're utilizing, cloud platforms like AWS, Azure, GCP, and the list goes on. And numerous SaaS applications, right? Whether it's Salesforce, ServiceNow, Workday, and so on. So the complexity of cybersecurity and authentication has evolved, and the requirements have changed. And most important, think about decentralized applications, the SaaS applications. If you go and log in and open up an account, for instance, with AWS, the very first page, they'll tell you cybersecurity and security is a shared responsibility. So the SaaS providers, the cloud providers, the decentralized applications put it right back on your plate that authentication and cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. So this has put IT and CISO and cybersecurity departments, frankly, under siege, right? Because the number of applications continue to grow. The applications, the cat's out of the bag. Some of these applications will forever be on the cloud or a SaaS environment. Some are going to be on-prem. But at the same time, you have to address the authentication and access needs. And then let's talk about the workforce. The workforce itself has evolved. What does that really mean? No longer are we not only behind a single campus or even regional offices as full-time and part-time employees. And we learned that, in the past 18 months during the way we worked during COVID crisis, I guess. But it's also true. We now have workforce that are offshore. Added to this complexity, we have a workforce that's gig-based, right? We use services like Upwork or temp or project-based employees or gig employees that come in and out our ecosystems. And from an administration and cybersecurity point of view, we are forced to give additional flexibility to a number of these applications and our secure environments, but we still have to manage authentication, and we have to ensure the users are who they are, right? So just some interesting stat to share with you. Average user has over 130 accounts. Most of us could only remember a handful of passwords. Over 60% of us reusing the same passwords. Guilty of that. Kids' names come up over and over again. Maybe I need to adopt more pets to come up with new passwords. But in reality, the problem is actually growing. It's not less. We're gonna have to have more passwords. Once in a great while, I get a notification from my browser that one of your usernames or passwords have been exposed in the dark web. So the reality is the problem's becoming more complex. The workforce is evolving. And again, the password managers are still, anything that's centralized, it is a single point of failure. So you have to have a better approach into this growing, evolving workforce and the evolving application environment, right? As I mentioned before, how we consume data has evolved also. It's not just from a laptop, a file system. We're consuming data now through browsers, right? Through tablets, through different file system, mobile devices, IoT edge, multifunctional printers, right? And growing number of SaaS that, again, will emphasize the fact that cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. The analogy that they use, which is absolutely to the point, is the utility company that provides power to my house, they're responsible for that gas and electric line up to the property line. If my water heater explodes or there's a fire, it's not necessarily the utility's fault. It's mine. I have to be responsible for it. And so they approach cybersecurity the same way. So in terms of authentication, there's only so much the SaaS, the cloud providers and applications could provide, or the network stack could provide. It really, in terms of authentication and access, you have to have an approach that addresses the evolving application, the evolving workforce, and the evolving complexity. So what is 3FA, right? And I mentioned is 2FA, is 3FA just simply better than 2FA? There's a couple of things to mention here. One is the most important thing to mention about 3FA. 3FA is effective if it's usable, if it takes some of the complexity of 2FA out. But the three takeaways from 3FA is the following. It's, first of all, something you know, could be a password, it could be a question, it could be an email address. It's something you have, it could be a token, a smart card. We'll talk about FIDO NFC technology. Could be your smartphone, and something you are. So a fingerprint, handprint, facial recognition. So those three things really combine into one. And even if one or two of those things are compromised, you still have the third factor that has to come in play. One of the takeaways, and I'll talk about this in a little more detail, is the fact that usability is the key. If you're going to introduce the third factor, you have to address simplicity and usability. And we look, and what I encourage you is to actually, after this call, is look up FIDO, which is the Fast Identity Online Alliance, supported by all, the majority of file systems and browsers and handheld devices, and NFC technology. So the two takeaways from FIDO and NFC specific to three-factor is the following, is that, first of all, a 3FA that leverages FIDO 2.0. So it addresses the complexity, right? So you don't necessarily have to worry about this continuous software upgrade or patches or unified endpoint management, where it constantly takes care of the third factor, right? The important thing about the 3FA is the fact that it utilizes an NFC technology or some kind of a technology that takes two things out of the equation. That it's a cold storage, cold device that doesn't need access to the internet. It doesn't need access to the system itself, or doesn't require power, right? Not like a USB stick where it requires the power. So in our view, an NFC technology is ideal for this, right? So imagine, when I'm traveling sometimes, do I give two of those factors maybe to my spouse because I'm on a plane and I'm trying to access some information? Yeah, I could do that. But if she does not have the card itself or the NFC technology, then she can't access the information. And that's the reality. It covers you from common human error. So when we talk about NFC technology, really it operates, it has to be within the other two factors within few inches. So it's like a card that you tapped at Starbucks. So the NFC technology has to be in the presence of the user. And it doesn't require power, right? And it doesn't need to be on the internet. So from that point of view, it gives you both accessibility and ease of use. And the most important thing about it is, if you know how to use a credit card, you know how to use the third factor or NFC card. And it addresses those three things I mentioned before. So in terms of trust and cold storage, again, what's great about an NFC FIDO-based 3FA is the following. First of all, it's a secure cold storage. So just keep this in mind. Stronger the isolation, stronger the integrity, right? So the fact that it cannot go on the internet, it cannot be plugged into a network, it can be tracked. The card is only active when it's within few inches of a device, like a laptop or a mobile phone or a multifunctional scanner printer with an NFC capability. It doesn't require charging or power. So if you keep that card in your wallet for a month, no problem. It doesn't need to be recharged, and uses NFC technology. And the most important thing is, after this call, if you go into your handheld device, your Android-based or your laptop, Windows 10 or your iOS, you'll see an option for NFC and FIDO. So it doesn't necessarily require software and a constant battle of upgrading the agents and the unified endpoint management to manage everything. So the usability is huge. And the fact that you could use this third factor authentication today with your AWS account. If you go into AWS, your IAM policy, you could actually enable NFC FIDO three-factor authentication. So from that point of view, the deployment model makes sense. But the most important thing that what I mentioned, the takeaway is not just three-factor is cool, is the fact that it addresses a couple of things we mentioned before. The complexity and evolution of growing number of applications that are both centralized, decentralized. The fact that we have an evolving workforce. Your IT and cybersecurity departments are under siege because you got temp workers, you got project-based employees, remote workers coming in and out. How do you give them access, and how do you address usability while maintaining cybersecurity? With that, I appreciate it. Thank you so much. Let me stop right there. And if Erica, if there's any specific questions,
We do.
yeah,
Al, we have a couple of questions from the Q&A and a few questions from the chat.
sure.
So from Rick on the Q&A, we have, what happens if I lose the card?
Yeah, that's a great question. So if you lose the card, the issuing company. So in our case, I'm with Arculus. Just a quick history. Sorry, I don't like to talk about the company. We've been around for 20 years as a company. We're the company behind issuing those metal credit cards for American Express and others. It's the same kind of workflow. So when you lose your metal credit card from American Express, you call American Express to issue a new card. So we have an ability to be the issuer. They're manufactured here in the US. Or if it's an OEM partner or a customer of ours like American Express or Chase, they issue the card directly to you, to the customer, right? Now, the most important thing, what I mentioned before, is that card by itself is useless. You have to have all three factors within few inches of each other to actually work. So even if you lose the card at the airport or a hotel, the card by itself is useless. It needs to be within the other two factors, right? And that card could always be replaced. So hopefully that answers your question. But again, to answer your fundamental question is the issuing company, whether it's us directly to you or a supplier or a vendor or a customer of ours like an American Express or a Chase that issues that metal credit card, it's the same workflow. Now, if you are a cybersecurity department and you're a large corporation and you want to issue those cards to your workforce, certainly we could support that workflow also.
Great, great. From the chat, we have Don asking, what companies are 3FA today in significant use?
So 3FA, that's a great question. So, without violating any NDAs, I'll focus on the vertical, which is 3FA actually has been embraced with regulated industries. Some data centers, when you walk in, require 3FA. Certainly in .gov deployments, certainly in I would say the government vertical and some healthcare have embraced. One of the things I want to make sure I emphasize this, just because it's been in place, it doesn't mean it's not painful, right? So the usability is key. If your 3FA requires a USB stick, if your 3FA requires you to plug in, because not you on this call know, USB sticks, anytime you plug into a device, that's a big no-no. If anything we learned from Snowden crisis is that USB sticks are not always the best thing to have. So there is some 3FA deployed out there on the regulated verticals, but usability is the key difference here. It's, whether you're talking to us or any vendor, make sure three questions come up if there's 3FA. Does it require power? Is it air gap cold storage, right? And the most important part for me is where these cars manufactured. Is it overseas? Is it in the US? So those are the things that are important, but the usability is key. So I emphasize the fact that if you know how to use a credit card, you know how to use NFC FIDO technology that we have, for instance, today, which is an NFC card. That's the big advantage. You could keep in your wallet. It could be your employee badge card. There's some space in there if you want to actually put images on there. But the fact is the usability. There is some 3FA deployed on regulated verticals, which includes financial, government, especially on the federal side, and then healthcare.
Yes, actually, I think you just addressed Felix's question. Can I use other IDs, wallets, etc.? What else can I do with the card? Felix, let me know if that doesn't cover that
Yeah,
question.
I could add to that. The card itself, and because it is cold storage, air gap cold storage, the card itself does have a small storage footprint. So you can actually store some data on the card itself. So by default, these cards usually have about 512 KB. So there's a little bit, I would say about a couple hundred KB worth of storage in there. And the cards can actually grow to 1024 KB. So what does that really mean? I mean, you think about like those national COVID cards that everyone has. Can you take something like that, or an employee ID, or a medical record, or some sensitive information, actually put it on the card itself, and no one could access it unless you have this three-factor authentication? The answer is yes. So there is a little bit of storage footprint available depending on your workflow and application.
Okay, great. Does three-factor authentication reduce your password resets?
It can. It can. One thing that is very important is any three-factor authentication that tries to mandate your workflow, walk away from it, right? It's the flexibility. So if indeed you want to utilize some kind of a password manager or passwordless, you can. The key thing is not about, it's about the user experience. So if you want to bring a layer of automation into the first two factors, you can. The third factor is kind of really the icing on the cake, which ensures that if your password manager or you're going passwordless, or one of the factors ever get compromised, whether it's ill intent or a hacker, it's still useless without the card, right? So that's the point.
Right. And to add to that, where the old passwords get breached in companies like Volkswagen, hackers have access on the dark web. Would 3FA, and I believe you just answered this, prevent them using? Obviously it does, because the passwords are useless without the cards themselves.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's without the card, without the card, the password themselves are useless. So all three factors have to be within a few inches of each other. The card itself, first of all, if I was in the other room, it wouldn't work. It has to be literally, like, have you ever gone to Starbucks and you tap one of those payment cards on that? It really literally has to be within certain inches. Think about why is it that a lot of the multifunctional scanner guys like Canon, Fujitsu, HP are all incorporating NFC, because one of the weak points in terms of authentication, and a lot of corporations are multifunctional scanners and printers, right? You are who you are trying to print that sensitive document. NFC technology actually addresses that, and all of them are supporting now with the newer generation NFC. So having this card, having three-factor authentication actually empowers that workflow, right? So yeah, I mean, if a hacker gets hold of your passwords, or even the second factor, you're still protected because they have to have all three within few inches of each other.
I apologize. I just read this one from Jay. I don't like to take my badge out of my wallet. Is it close enough if I have it in my pocket?
Has to be. So the reality is, if you could keep it in your wallet, but you don't necessarily have to take your wallet, but the card itself still has to be within a few inches of the NFC reader, right? Within that, whether it's like these mobile devices could be your NFC reader, your laptop. So if it's technically is within, few inches, I would say less than 3 or 4 inches. Technically it's a 6, but in reality you're working it well. It's going to be less than 6 inches. So if you could position yourself within a few inches of that device, you could do it. But from a personal experience, I usually just tap
Take it
the
out and
device.
tap
Yeah, that's
it.
exactly it.
Um, I think this might be the last one. Are there US-based companies making 3FA or other US-based companies making 3FA, or are they all offshore?
So it's important when we talk about just a general 3FA, whether it's for traditional authentication or for a blockchain application. There are other vendors that do cold storage, but here's two important factors. One is almost every one of them in that category requires some power at some point. So the power could either come from a battery or plug it into your laptop. Um, the minute something has to plug in into an electronic device, for me, it's a big warning sign, right? That's unnecessary risk. Number two is a lot of these manufacturers are actually overseas, whether it's China, Taiwan, Czech Republic, and nothing against them. I'm sure they're viable technology. I wouldn't necessarily put them in the category of enterprise, but the difference is, yeah, I mean, we manufacture. By the way, the reason we manufacture is because the existing business of manufacturing metal credit cards for the last 20 years, selling to the American Express of this world, mandated that the manufacturing and that supply chain be here in US to ensure integrity. So we're just following an existing workflow that's been around for 20 years. But yeah, a lot of these vendors do produce three factors overseas. But I don't necessarily think just being overseas is a risk factor. I think the fact that they require battery, they require plugging in into an electronic device, just negates some of the value of 3PFA. You really want that third factor to be completely cold storage, not accessible by internet. Not, there should be no need for a battery. So a card that requires no power and you could keep it like a credit card in your wallet isn't ideal, right? It addresses the third risk.
Actually, we just got a another question on that very topic. Doesn't it increase the risk by plugging something in that it is actually accessing your data?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the question. In
So
terms of the card or the third
I
factor?
think I think what the question is asking is if there's a 3FA device that's plugging into your electronic,
Yeah.
doesn't it increase the risk because it's accessing your data instead?
This is okay. So this is very important to mention. This is simply an authentication, and when we say a card doesn't.
Well,
Yeah, the
I
card.
think
Yeah.
instead of the card not accessing because you're just touching, right?
Yep.
It's near, right? This cold storage as
Yep.
opposed to the others that plug in.
That's right. The other ones plug in into a device, but the card itself doesn't plug in into a device. It's simply like a credit card, like those chips you see on a credit card. It's it's a it's based on nearline. It's NFC technology, so there is no it has limitation in terms of its access within the device within few inches. So if I took it 12 inches, like if I hold it over here, it cannot access the device.
Right. I think
And
what
there's,
you're asking
yeah,
is it a red flag if something has to plug in because then
absolutely.
that's giving you access to something.
If it has to plug in, is a red flag, right? As I mentioned before, this is why in a lot of regulated verticals, USB sticks are a big no-no, right? That is why you see a lot of computers and laptops without USB ports,
Hmm.
or you can't even walk in the meeting with a USB. If anything, we learned during this Snowden crisis that any security device or any
That's exactly what
non-secure
they're
device,
saying.
Yeah, the
Right. They
USB
said
device.
in their company they have their USB ports disabled.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly it. It's another point of entry that you want to eliminate.
Right. I apologize. I wasn't quite understanding their question, but
Sure.
that's what it was. All right. Well, I think I've gotten all to everyone's questions. Appreciate your time, Al. Thank you very much for joining and explaining 3FA for us and the evolution. And hope to have you on again sometime soon.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you everyone for joining.